You can all go ahead and grab a seat.
Well, hey, everybody, good morning to you. Happy Sunday to you. Thank you so much for being here. We're in week 5 of this series that's focused on the stories of Jesus, the parables that Jesus told. And I hope this series and everything involved with it is helpful and encouraging and clarifying and especially challenging for you. We're going to look at another parable today, another one of Jesus' stories. This is found in the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. If you have a Bible, open it up to Matthew 25, first 13 verses. Here's what Jesus said. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight, there was a shout, "Look, here's the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." While they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you." And here's Jesus' comment about it. "Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." This is a story about what might be the 2 saddest words in the English language. If only. This is a story about the if only factor. I don't know if you've ever had this dream before. It's kind of common. I've had it before. But in the dream, you're going to school and you walk into a class, and it's a class you've been taking all semester, but you realize that today is the final. And you haven't prepared at all. You hadn't studied at all. And you are woefully unprepared. You're in trouble. You haven't got a prayer. Anybody else ever have that dream before? Yeah. For sure. I used to have that as a student, and then when I started teaching and preaching, I had a variation of that dream where, I was supposed to speak, or I was invited to speak somewhere, and the time came for me to get up to talk, and I had not prepared at all. I had nothing to say, and it was just a total disaster. Some of you are like, "How is that different from any other Sunday, Dave?" It's like, settle down. One of my favorite stories is about a student who's unprepared for a test. Some of you may remember this before, but this kid's taken a class in ornithology, which is the study of birds. And it's a very difficult class. The professor has a very difficult class by reputation. And he walks in for the final, this kid, and he's really studied hard. He thinks he's well prepared. But when he walks in, there's no paper or pencils or questions or anything like that. There are just pictures on the wall, 25 pictures of birds, but only their feet, just the feet of the birds. And the professor says, "Here's your final. You must identify 25 species of birds by just their feet." And the kid is like, "Man, that's impossible. This is crazy, Nobody in the right mind can, pass this. I thought I was prepared. I studied really hard, but I can't pass this. I'm not going to take this test," he says. And the professor says, "Well, you got to take it. I decide what's on the final, and you got to take this test." And the kid says, "Well, I'm not going to take it. I'm not taking the final." And the professor says, "Well, if you don't take it, I'm going to fail you." The kid says, "All right, then fail me, because I'm not taking this test." And the professor says, "All right, you failed. What's your name?" And the kid rolls up his pant legs to his knees and says, "You tell me." I so hope that is true. I don't know if it is, but listen, when you're a student, it's wise to remember one truth, that there is a final coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's coming. So be prepared, because you don't want to have to say, if only I'd studied, if only I'd prepared. This is a fundamental truth about human life, and Jesus, the wisest teacher who ever lived, he wants us to get it. So he tells a story about a wedding and some bridesmaids. And in the story, they have just one task, the bridesmaids: be ready for the groom. Have oil in their lamps, for their lamps, so that they can light the way and be ready for the celebration. Now, in Jesus' day, we got to understand a wedding would go on for days. And at the very end, of this, on the last day, the groom would come to the bride's home, generally to escort the bride to the final ceremony, and then all the party and celebration and dancing and all that stuff afterwards. And when that event was about to happen, before the groom got there, a friend of the groom would go ahead of him. And that's what's going on in Jesus' story. A friend of the groom goes ahead of the groom and says, hey, everybody, the bridegroom is coming. The bridegroom is coming. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. The bridegroom is coming. Something like that, And everybody get all excited. And they go out to meet the bridegroom. It's pretty different in our day. In our day, in weddings in our day, it's the bride who's the focus, The bride is the one who comes down the center aisle, and all the attention is focused on the bride. In fact, in my wedding, more than 28 years ago, 1995, I didn't walk down the center aisle. I walked in from the side. There's no fanfare. There's no music. No announcement. Nobody went before me. Just quietly walked in and stood there. But when my wife, Melanie, when she walked in, just before she walked in, we had hired this trumpeter, and he belted out this fanfare, blazing. He belted that out, and it jolted everybody a bit. It's a peppy fanfare, and everybody perked up in their seats. And when that fanfare was finished, a big old pipe organ kicked in with thunder blasts that just shook the room, and together with that trumpeter, they cranked out Trumpet Volunteer, and then the doors swung open and the light shone in, and everybody stood to their feet as my wife sauntered on down, the center aisle there all the way to the front, Nobody stood up when I came in. No trumpet announced my arrival. No pipe organ blasted anything out, because it's all about the bride in our day. And we typically use the same word to describe a bride on her wedding day, right? Just one word. Everybody says that the bride looks radiant. Radiant is usually the word used to describe the bride. Nobody really describes the groom at all. Nobody even notices the groom most of the time. Like the groom is like a prop, Seriously, it's like, decor. There's the groom, he's decor with the candles and the flowers, that sort of thing. Most of the time, people even ask, which one is the groom? Who is the groom standing up there? Is that him beside that handsome preacher? That's what I usually hear, Because it's all about the bride in our day, But in Jesus' parable and in Jesus' day, it's all about the groom. The focus is on the groom. Now, in verse 5, it says the bridegroom is delayed. And we don't know why. Maybe got stuck in traffic, or his plane, was delayed a little bit, or the line was long at Chick-fil-A. We don't know why he's delayed, but he's delayed. And we don't know how long, not for forever. And in this story, the bridegroom primarily bears the significance of Jesus. Jesus is going to return. But see, this story is not just for people who will be alive when Jesus returns. It's significant for all of us. It's not just a story that has to wait a few thousand years to be relevant. It's significant for everybody. See, the day is coming, Jesus is saying in this story, when justice is going to roll down like a mighty water. When the wrongs of this world will be set right. The day is coming, Jesus says, when we will see the truth about the entire world and all the confusion and all the mess it's all going to get sorted out. Everything's going to be brought to light. We'll see the truth about your life and about my life. We'll come to understand that this world is not just an endless, random sequence of events. It's a story. It's a story that God initiated and God is leading, and it will have an ending. Your life is a story, and mine too, and our stories will have an ending. They have meaning and significance and moral weight, like all that's involved in the return of the groom. And in Jesus' story here, there are people who have oil for their lamps and some people who don't. And by this business of lamp and oil, you can understand this is about your life and mine, about your character and mine, about your heart and mine, about your attitude and mine. It's about your life and mine. See, these bridesmaids had just one task, and that was to make sure that their lamp was ready. Just have enough oil so they can be a part of the celebration. And the significance of this is to make sure that you and I, we have lived in such a way that from an eternal perspective, our life is lived wisely and well. Make sure that we give ourselves to that which is worthy, and we don't get distracted by that which is meaningless. Make sure you're ready. Jesus says in verse 6, the bridegroom was delayed, and nobody knows for how long, but then it says, at midnight, there's a shout, and now the word comes, the bridegroom's returning. 5 of the bridesmaids aren't prepared. They have no oil. So they ask the wise bridesmaids, though that have some oil, if they can borrow some of their oil. And the wise bridesmaids say, no. Now, why don't the wise girls lend some oil to the foolish ones? Like that seems a little selfish, doesn't it? Seems a little petty, seems a little mean. Like what's going on here? Is this like some sort of reality TV show like Bridesmaids of Jerusalem County or something like that, you know? Like Mean Girls of the Bible or something? What's up with this? Well, the point that Jesus is getting at here, in the words of William Barclay, there are some things that cannot be borrowed. A relationship with God cannot be borrowed. Not from your parents or your children or your cousins or your friends. You must have it for yourself. Character cannot be borrowed. Not from your parents or your children or your cousins or your friends. You are responsible for your character. A life cannot be borrowed. And everyone is building a life. And one day, you will stand before God with your life. And when you wait to go before the throne of God, you will not be able to say to the person behind you, hey, like my 20s were pretty bad. Can I borrow your 20s to go before God? It does not work that way. The point of the oil is Jesus is driving home with brutal honesty the truth that we try to avoid all the time, that I am responsible to God for my life. And no doubt there are certain things that you can't control, certain factors that you can't control, you know, your genes, who your parents are, that sort of thing. But there is a little spark that God has placed in you that the Bible calls a will, and you can choose. You can choose right or wrong, good or evil, love or hate. God's sovereignty will not suppress the ability to choose for yourself that God has entrusted to you. You have a choice to choose God or not, and you have a choice as to what place a relationship with Him will play in your life. And we make these choices hundreds of times a day, and they are knitting the fabric of our souls together, and we cannot borrow them from somebody else. That's the significance of the oil borrowing factor. You know, very often we go through life just sort of trying to push off our responsibility for all this. But Jesus relentlessly hammers home this truth. You and I, we are responsible for preparing. And here we come to another very deep truth, too, in this parable. It's possible to wait until it's too late. These bridesmaids discover they can't borrow somebody else's oil, so they're desperate, and they're told to go out and just buy some somewhere. But you remember, what time is it now? Yeah, it's midnight. I mean, where are they going to find it? There's no Home Depot or Lowe's or even a 7-Eleven that's open 24 hours a day back then to carry oil. And they discover a couple more very sad words. It's too late. Like while the groom was delayed, it seemed like they had all the time in the world. But the day is coming for every one of us, Jesus is saying, when we will see that time is unspeakably precious and relentlessly short. Too late. If only. And notice this is not a story about trying to figure out when the groom is returning. Like too many people act as if Jesus said, try to figure out when the groom will return. And too many have tried, way too many. Too many have approached the Bible as if it has some sort of insider information so that we could have a lowdown on when the end is coming so we could cram for it, get ready for it, you know? But look what Jesus says in verse 13. He does not say to try and figure out when the day and the hour are getting close. In fact, he pretty much says the opposite. He says, keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. See, the groom is coming, and there are 5 bridesmaids who are totally unprepared, completely unprepared. Of course, one question we wonder is, like, how did it happen? How do people end up wasting their life? And again, this is where Jesus is so wise. You notice the adjective that he uses in this story. The 5 without oil, the 5 who are unprepared, they're not called evil bridesmaids or wicked bridesmaids. What are they called? Foolish. Just foolish. Why didn't you bring oil for your lamp? We want to ask them. You know what they'd say if we could ask them? Same thing little kids say when you ask them why they did something foolish. I don't know. I don't know. You know, it's the amazing thing in the story, and this is what I'm so profoundly anxious for all of us to see, because there is deep truth in here about how human lives get wasted. The characters in the story who are not prepared for the return of the groom, they're not defiant. They don't shake their fist at God and say, you know, I don't want anything to do with you. I don't care about you. I'm walking my own way. They don't rebel. They don't even decide. They just sort of float along. They go with the flow. They drift. Jesus is saying, as a general rule, that's what happens in human life. Not always, but often. People get to the end of their one and only life, and if you were to ask them, why didn't you devote yourself to knowing God? Like, why didn't you make much of an attempt to seek him and honor him, get to know him? You know, why didn't you nurture the gifts that he entrusted to you? Why didn't you take great risks for God's church and his kingdom? Why did you spend your one and only life consumed by all kinds of other things, Netflix, you know, or obsessing over what people think about you? Why'd you waste your life over just, I don't know, pleasure seeking or power? Why did you live like you did? Why did you live like you had all the time in the world? Why didn't you prepare for the return of the groom? And they will say, I don't know. At the time, it just didn't seem all that important. Other things seemed to be more pressing, or they were easier to do, you know. There's a kind of spiritual complacency that sets in on the human heart, you know, a failure to have an appropriate sense of urgency about what matters most. I'll tell you how important this teaching is to Jesus, you know. In the 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke from the Bible, you know, last week we actually held our 18-year celebration as a church, and our special guest, Vince Antonucci, he spoke about the 15th chapter of Luke. It's where Jesus tells 3 parables of searching for a lost thing, a lost coin, a lost sheep, a lost son, where all that goes on. And Jesus wanted to hammer that point home, this whole idea about who God is, and he searches for lost things. And so he tells 3 stories about it, 3, to make sure that we get it. Now, the context for this story that we're looking at, Matthew 25, 1 through 13, if you actually back the truck up and you check out the whole context of it, Matthew 24, 42 through Matthew 25, 30, and you read that section maybe later today or later this week or something, but there are 4 parables back to back to back to back, and all 4 of them, they make the same point. There's a story of the thief that comes suddenly in the night, a story about the bridesmaids that we're looking at today, and 2 stories about servants whose master suddenly returns. And in every one of them, the same point gets made. Don't live your one and only life in a way that leaves you saying, if only. You know, I don't know what it is for you. I mean, maybe there's something that you need to address, but you just keep putting it off. And I got to tell you, the biggest rock to get in the jar, like the most important thing to be prepared for, is stepping into a relationship, an active relationship with Jesus Christ, where you're seeking him and connecting with him and honoring him, where he is first. And then you start to let that invade, that relationship impact and invade all these other areas of your life where the lordship of Jesus Christ just takes over, whatever it is, whatever area it is, finances, your relationships, your sexuality, your marriage, your parenting, your family, your school, your work, whatever it is. He just begins to invade your thinking and your speech and just every area you give over to him. But there's so many of us that we just keep putting it off, or we keep holding back, or we just kind of just go with the flow of our culture. Maybe for some of us, if we're honest, we're just pretty lazy. We're lazy when it comes to faith. And we got our excuses why we shouldn't do this or shouldn't take a step. Or maybe we got our hang-ups. We can point our finger at something that keeps us from moving forward, preparing. Some of you may have intellectual things that you're like, I'm just not sure about this. And it's a legit thing to think through. We're not trying to check our brains at the door. But you're not really doing anything about that. You're not studying or reading or talking to anyone about it. You're just putting it off. I want us all to eliminate the regret factor in our lives, what really matters. I want us to eliminate the if only factor in our lives, starting today. A couple of weeks ago, I visited my dad, who's in East Tennessee. He just turned 87 years of age. I hung out with him for several days over that particular weekend, which meant we watched a lot of Westerns. That's what it meant. Usually, whenever we call my dad, me or my brothers would say, "Hey, Dad, what are you doing?" He's like, "I'm watching a Western." The time we asked him, said, "Hey, did the good guy win?" And he said, "The whole town won," which is a good way to think about it. But I went and visited him. I told you about him before, but he was a vocational minister, led a church for 60 years. He led the same church for 53 years, and he did it with incredible integrity, did it with incredible fervor. He worked full-time till he was 80 years old, and then he started watching Westerns. But I got to thinking about a few years ago, right after my mother passed, that in that same room where we were watching Westerns just a couple weeks ago, we were sitting, and we started going down memory lane a few years back, right after my mom died, right after the funeral and all that. And there was this memory book that he was thumbing through, and we were looking at, and we were talking. And as my dad was looking at it all, he made a comment. I'll never forget his comment. He said, "I got no regrets. That was a blast. I'd do it all over again." What a great thing it would be if all of us in this room could say, when we're nearing the end of our life, and as we look forward to the coming of the groom, and we could say, as best as I can, when I look at the basic fundamental areas of my life, I really did, seeking God's help as best I could, live in such a way as to reach the end of my life and say, that was a blast, no regrets. I'd do it all over again. I have prepared for the bridegroom. Do you know God wants that for you? The last thing in the world God wants is for you to reach the end of your life with a pile of regrets. That's why Jesus came. That's why we have the Bible. That's why he went to the cross. That's why God's Spirit is available to be with you. But here's the deal, gang. The groom is coming back. We don't know when, but as sure as you and I sit here, the groom is coming back. So be wise. Prepare. I want to give us some time to think about this, talk to God about this, and resolve today, whatever step you got to take, whatever thing you keep procrastinating on and putting off, you just say, all right, no more. We're going to celebrate communion where we take some bread and juice, and it reminds us of Jesus' body and his blood that's given for us. I invite you to take some time and reflect on this and thank God for this and think about your life and talk to him about your life in these few moments. Let's celebrate communion now. If you didn't get one of those individually wrapped packets, you can do that now in the back.